So today we're cycling down the River Barrow, starting with heading to the Grand Canal from the usual starting spot at the roundabout, Phoenix Park roundabout in Dublin. Go on to the Grand Canal on Ballyfermot, follow that through to, I think, Robertstown, and then switch to Barrow navigation. That Barrow navigation, the Barrow River, is the second longest river in Ireland. It runs down to Waterford, and for a lot of Irish history was one of the most important routes on the eastern side of the island. So I'll tell you a bit more about the navigation of it, because they had to dig channels for parts of it to get around bits you couldn't get a barge through, as we're actually doing it. Total distance 207 kilometres, a little bit more than that actually. And I'm not bringing any charger with me, but I do have 2 batteries, so I will expect the second battery to be very nearly exhausted by the time I make it. There's an added thrill to the whole thing. But crossing the Phoenix Park now, let's have a look at the road ahead. There really is a bit of a howling wind blowing. I'm wondering how that's going to impact the battery, but I also wanted to check how good the windsock is at killing noise, so there's a good test. Exiting the park here and heading into Chapel Lizard, then crossing the bridge at Chapel Lizard and up the very steep hill that brings you into and then through Ballyfermot, going by Lafanu Park there on the right, then past the industrial estate, and then a sharp right turn onto the canal itself. So this is an 8.5 kilometre section. We're cycling about 7 kilometres of it, and it has one problem, which is sometimes they close the kissing gates on it, which can make it a bit hard to navigate if you're on a bike that's loaded for touring. And indeed, as I come across here, this guy had come in on a ferry the previous night, gone to a campsite, and was having to navigate those kissing gates to get back into town and get a train. So here we reach Omer's Lockhouse. So 1757, Thomas Omer, who's originally from Holland, is over in Ireland, and he starts building the Grand Canal from this spot. He built about 18 kilometres of it, mostly travelling out like this, and at that point, at a cost of about £58,000 back then, which was obviously a lot of money, but at that point Dublin Council took an interest because they realised that the canal could be a way of providing fresh water to the city. So this is the 12th lock, and this part I'd previously chickened out of trying to get through, not because of that first gate, but because of this second one coming up. It's actually quite tricky to get past. You can instead take to the roads here and do a triangle that brings you back on at Hazelhatach. I did get a very bad close pass there though. So this time when I hit that 11th lock back there, and what is a very hard to pass barrier, I decided I would unload the bike and lift it over the barrier. So it can be done, no big deal really, but obviously depends on what sort of state your back is in for lifting, and you're not going to get through that in a cargo bike. But unfortunately they've got the kissing gate shut as well, so anybody on a cargo bike is going to be in trouble today. I don't know, I guess they must have had more kits than usual on scramblers, and that's why they've done it. A bit annoying, to put it mildly. As we are seeing, there's a remarkable potential in the Royal Canal and the Grand Canal to offer very long distance safe cycling routes going way out across the country to the Shannon, and then connecting up with other lines that go to Athlone, and as I'm going to be doing on this trip, going all the way down to Saint Mullins. And there are stretches, quite long stretches now, of the canal that have good surfaces. They really function very well like that. However, particularly close to Dublin, there are sections that are like this. A cycling route is only as safe as its most dangerous part, and if in effect you have this section forcing people onto a busy main road with lots of trucks on it, then it's really not safe. So it's not the sort of thing you're going to bring young children on for a long distance holiday. Now here, however, there's something interesting. These seem to be Waterways Ireland people I was passing, so I'm kind of hoping they're surveying this section, which is about 3 kilometres long, and looking at the possibility of maybe opening it up in the near future, because the sections beyond have now largely been opened. That would certainly greatly expand the proportion of the canal that could be cycles. Part of the reason I think it's so haphazard is a lot of the work is being driven by local councils, and some people have said that Waterways Ireland itself don't really take the issue of cyclist provision very seriously. They're not very interested in it, and that perhaps would explain the lack of joined up thinking, and also the really long running problem on the Royal Canal at the deep sinking, which is unlikely to be resolved for years, and which is blocking the Eurovelo 2 route, which is meant to be running from Dublin to Galway after coming all the way from Moscow. You frequently get cyclists asking on online forums for a route map for this, because they obviously know it's meant to exist but they can't find it, and the answer is sorry lads, that doesn't really exist. However, if you look at my other canal videos, you'll see I have done a way of getting to Galway which uses the sections of the canal you can travel on, then uses the old rail line that gets to Athlone, and then from there you're on roads. The Athlone to Galway section is now in the planning process to put in some sort of greenway that's going to run there. But it's likely that deep sinking section, which runs from Castleknock, is not going to be sorted out for another decade, which is a real tragedy, and in quite a literal sense as well, because forcing cyclists off safe routes like this onto main roads does end in tragedy for some, unfortunately. One counterpoint I will mention is that this section as it stands is very beautiful. It's wilderness, it's kind of wonderful to cycle through, and if they tarmac it all, well, that might ruin that. There is a legitimate point there. I think a lot of the tarmacking and turning it to cycleway has been overdone, and it's ended up creating a sterilised strip. I'm kind of hoping, as with older cycleways I've seen in the Spanish state, that in fact that's just an initial post-construction look, and that they will allow these spaces to becoming quite overgrown again. Anyway, here we are approaching Hazelhatach, where you suddenly find yourself in a pub's beer garden with yet another gate to get through, and as you'll see, there are a lot of houseboats here. There's now a lot of people living on the canals, with Waterways Ireland as the landlord, which some people say Waterways Ireland aren't really happy with having that role. And one thing I have heard is that apparently that 12th lock isn't just hard to pass on a bicycle, but it's very hard to get the key for it. So in other words, if you have a houseboat over here, you can't really get into Dublin, because to get into Dublin you'd have to get through that 12th lock. So another story. I mean, previously I have been very positive about Waterways Ireland. They did take over a situation of multiple derelict canals and other waterways around Ireland, both north and south. They were post-peace process creation. They have managed to open all of those up, but I think recently we're also seeing the problem of a inflexible bureaucracy that lacks imagination on some of these issues, and that isn't doing as much with this absolutely fantastic recreational space, but also realistically a housing space, as what it could be doing. Anyway, rant off. The canal along this section has got quite a few historical connections. You may have read that bottom note I had there about the IRA ambush in 1921. But we're coming up here to Lyons Estate, which was a big estate built in 1797, so shortly after the canal itself had been built by Lord Colconny. And his son, the second Lord Colconny, was apparently imprisoned twice in the Tower of London for involvement in the 1798 rebellion. As with the other houses, things fell into a state of disrepair. University College Dublin bought the estate in 1962, and this section just in here on the left is now a hotel, and I think there's a cafe you can probably pop into there if you want a break from the cycling, but don't worry, there's also more cafes coming up in a moment. When Emmet's rebellion took place in 1803, a lot of people from this locality, and Ardclough in particular, was said to take part in the rebellion and then brought their wounded home along this canal towpath. Henry Bridge, that we just passed, was another local rich man who was supposedly involved in the rebellion, and the bridges along this section in fact have, or originally had, the names of various rich families. They sort of sponsored them, I guess, and it's thought they paid up to £1,000, which back then would have been a lot of money, to have their names permanently attached to the bridge and to be remembered by them. By the time of the 1803 rebellion, in fact, the canal had been completed all the way from Dublin to the Shannon and was now carrying passenger traffic. It was a very long 18-hour journey to get from Dublin to the Shannon, but probably a lot more comfortable than the options that had previously existed of coach and horses. And of course, within a couple of decades, the railways were to completely replace that and undermine it. Our friend Thomas Omer, though, he only built the canal as far as the 13th lock back there, and after that there was less money basically to complete it. It was more successful than the rival Royal Canal, but was still not really a huge money making venture, and around the 13th lock it narrows. So this is a relatively newly opened section here. If you've watched my video doing the Grand Canal and Royal Canal loop out to Mullingar, this had sort of opened the last time I cycled it, but the surface wasn't compacted down, and then when I hit the Sallins end, they'd a quite impassable gate that I had to squeeze around with the help of a jogger who happened to pass at that point. But today I'm expecting it to be fully open, and then from Sallins it'll be another 10 kilometres to Robertstown, and then I'm going to be turning onto the Barrow way. Now I anticipate the Barrow way being quite rough, so we'll see how passable that is. It's not really a cycling way, it's a walking way. This may be a good point to ask who actually built the canal, and the answer to that is we don't know a lot about them. Navvies is the name they came to be called because of the navigation element of the building, and it's thought on the Grand Canal maybe 3,000 men worked on it at any one time, but the records that were kept are kind of sparse. And there's all sorts of rumours, like apparently in this area it was thought prisoners were brought from Mountjoy to work on it, although there's no record of that either. A reminder there that it still takes human labour to keep the canal open today. Anyway, if you've made a late start and you're looking for a camping spot, there's a nice spot just here I think will be quite good. You're just coming up to Sallins here. But you would be not going very far. We're probably only about 30 kilometres from our start point at that. If we'd been on this bank in 1780, we might have been passed by the first passenger barge heading towards Sallins. That's when the service actually started and expanded again in 1781. Our first account of travel on the canal is from 4 years later in 1785, when John Wesley, who's the founder of Methodism, wrote, Wednesday 22nd of June, I went with 12 or 14 of our friends on the canal to Prosperous. It is a most elegant way of travelling, little inferior to that of Traxoits in Holland. We had 50 or 60 persons in the boat, many of whom desired me to give them a sermon. I did so, and they were all attention. For comparison, it took 4 days to travel by coach from Dublin to Galway in that period. So just had lunch in Cafe Grange there behind me. It's kind of handy actually because you can bring your bicycle into the garden, which is down the side street there. And it was $21.50 for a very large chicken pasta pesto dish, sticky toffee pudding with ice cream, and a cappuccino. By 1818, there were 10 passenger boats and something like 375 trading boats operating on the Grand Canal. The passenger fare was a guinea, which would have been a lot of money back in those days, but the passenger boats were still carrying about 100,000 people per year, which was a massive improvement in transportation in Ireland in compared to what existed previously. Now, of course, that's probably around the peak of the canal. Within a couple of decades, you have the railways coming, and that basically demolishes the passenger trade. Our flying stations are hatch on here from the water. That's why you see Sallins and Sandbank outside the bank of the river, and then also in the back. That aqueduct over the Liffey, which is called the Leinster Aqueduct, has got to be one of the most significant engineering feats of building the canal. It's quite a bit up, but as you go from here down towards Digby Bridge, and you do have this hard gate to negotiate in the meantime, you come across a structure that had me very puzzled. The first time I did this route, I stopped by about 10 minutes,
couldn't work out what it was, and then couldn't find anything at all online. But since then, in fact, I have found something, and what it is called the Four Pots. So, those are known as the big pot, the little pot, the bouillon and the skillet, and there are 4 concentric circles, each of which is a little bit lower than the previous ones, and the idea is that the water from the canal, the overflow water, would go in, and then the Liffey's quite a long way below, so as it dropped through those circles, the force of the water would drop, and that's basically so that it didn't arrive as a waterfall in the Liffey and then perhaps damage the Liffey's banks. But that actually dates from about 1784. It was derelict for a long time. It appears it may not have actually been used very much, and then they restored it back in 2020. Here's a bit of rough surface as a sample. When you're looking at a canal, you don't really think of the water management aspect, or at least I didn't initially. You just think it's a bit like a river. But in fact, it's really complicated. It's going above the groundwater level in some places, far above it here. In other places, it's going far below it. The banks have got to retain water, but they can't retain too much water. You can't have the canal overflowing and flooding low-lying land around it, and likewise you can't have it drying out. So there's quite complex things going on all the time to maintain the level, as it's called, and one of the roles of the old lock keepers, for instance, was to be regularly measuring the level and then controlling the amount of water coming in from rivers or the amount that was allowed to escape out through overflow systems. So all of this, you're going along the canal, you don't think about it. If you're in a boat though, you'd be very aware of it, because you don't want to be grounding the boat at the locks. And of course also, each time a lock gate is open or closed, that means there's water flowing from the higher reaches of the canal down towards the lower reaches. And then, of course, volumes of water are pretty valuable economically in their own right. So we've just passed a point where the bank appears to have been broken down to allow cattle to access it for drinking purposes, which probably happened when the canal was derelict. But of course, we've also seen already that Dublin City Council was very keen on getting the canal water to Dublin back in the late 1700s, because it represented a way of having a clean water supply for the city. So in other words, if you're running a canal, there's a whole lot of management issues going on besides the boats on it. We're now on the approach to Robertstown. We're moving a bit faster than the canal construction did. It took 29 years, in fact, to reach Robertstown. And Robertstown was the site of one of the 5 hotels the directors of the canal built along it, to basically as accommodation for passengers. Now that was never all that successful. It was built in 1801, but in fact by 1813 the directors had already sold the hotel, or rather rented it out, and they were getting other people to run it. Canal traffic peaked in 1845 with 111,000 passengers and 280,000 tonnes of cargo being carried, but the hotel was sold off in 1853. Both the hotel and the old warehouses in Robertstown give a sense of the prosperity the canal did bring to these communities in the initial years of operation, before the railway started to replace the passenger service, and then later on the roads were to replace the freight service. But now we approach the ironically named Low Town, which is in fact the high point of the canal. That is the highest point above sea level and the highest lock.
So we've hit the bit where the Grand Canal keeps heading for the Shannon that way, and I'm going to be coming around onto the Barrow navigation and hopefully getting all the way down to Saint Mullins. We shall see.
So the canal does go on to the Shannon, but our goal is the River Barrow, and Saint Mullins was still a good distance from that. So the Barrow line here, splitting off at Lowtown, was basically to connect the Grand Canal to the River Barrow. The River Barrow historically might be the oldest of the Irish waterways used for transportation. The records certainly seem to suggest that even before the Normans arrived, there was significant freight being shipped up and down the Barrow in boats that could carry about 4 tons each. The Barrow line was set up in 1792. A company was set up to start building it, and the goal was to basically increase the cargo that could be carried by a magnitude. So instead of having boats that could carry 4 tons, you'd have boats that could carry 40 tons. Now obviously, although the river was already being used for a lot of traffic, this had a transformative effect. It greatly increased the amount of cargo that could be carried on the river and increased prosperity all down it. So all the towns as we go down here have warehouses and dry docks and other things like that were built in this period because of the increased freight that it was now possible to move on the river. However, it wasn't straightforward. The section we're going through here is actually very close to the Bog of Allen. It was hard to build, it collapsed at various stages, and that's why we saw earlier on that there's a new Barrow line and an old Barrow line, because the old Barrow line had bank collapses. So as we're making this stage of our journey down the Grand Canal's Barrow line connection and then onto the Barrow itself, I'd invite you to consider just how old the history of this is. The canal is very young, it's 1792 and onwards, but the Barrow itself was probably seeing significant river traffic even under the Vikings. In other words, trade boats were probably coming up here. It's also actually quite possible that even as far back as the Neolithic, you had basic coracles and boats like that being used. But the sort of evidence of traffic goes back to the medieval period. That's then taken over by the Normans. And there's an interesting claim that I made in 1952, that of the workers on the Barrow, the boatmen were all coming from the west bank out of the river and not from the east bank, which is where the Pale was. And it was speculated that that's because the traditions of those men working the rivers were actually pre-Norman, with the Normans taking over much of the trade after that, but the actual proletarians, if you like, were being drawn from the traditional workers of the west bank of the river. I have a friend, Dr. Aileen O'Carroll, who wrote a book on the Dublin dockers, and one of the interesting stories within this is the way the dockers used to essentially pilfer goods from some of the boats. Containerisation changed that. But reading about the Barrow workers, although there was a denial they did similar, I did come across a very funny anecdote which said that in warm weather, when they were transporting ale, the ale would swell in the casks, and if they weren't careful about it, the casks would burst. So with the full understanding of the owners of the casks, what they would do to prevent the bursting and the loss of the entire cargo is they'd take a few pints out of the top of each barrel, and that would reduce the pressure and save it. And then in a similar light, there was a very bizarre story about the transporting a mystery cargo upriver. They taste leakage from it and it's clearly rum, so they drain some of the rum off, knock the rum back. Then as they approach Dublin, they're met by a courier who says, "Do you have the package?" And they go, "Oh yes." They're kind of concerned about what the fuss is, and they get to Dublin and they're met at the dock by a hearse, and the hearse takes the mystery carriage off because it turns out the rum was being used to preserve the body of someone who had died in Newfoundland inside that carriage. Whoops. So I think I'm still on the Grand Canal connection to the Barrow rather than the Barrow proper. Surface here is the kind of gritty stuff, which is a little bit more resistant to the tyres. So my battery drainage has increased, and I'm going, I wonder if the two of them will be enough to make the full distance. However, if not, I'll just turn it into my low assist modes. Check my previous videos for that, the custom mode, and then I should be okay. I can do that tomorrow morning, depending on what distance I've done today. When we reach the Barrow itself at the end of this day, you'll see it is much more stunning than the canals, but this section of the canal is seriously impressive. You get a sense from that clip of just how windy it's become. I'm kind of carefully watching my battery at this stage and worried it's going to run out before the whole journey. So what I've done is I've now turned it down to the much lower assist custom method. That's possible with my Nion. I'll post a link to how that's done for anybody who's particularly interested in e-bikes, but also it's starting to get quite wet. So getting a little bit of rain here.
I'm slightly nervous about getting too wet because it's getting late-ish, so I mightn't be able to dry off properly, and I don't want to have to get into a tent damp, so I'm just going to hide under a bridge for a while. Very close to Monasterevin now anyway, so I'll probably stop there for some food.
Of course, some of the history of this region is much older than the periods I've been talking about. The Hill of Allen, for instance, is nearby. That's got legends going right back to Finn McCool. But also there are early Christian legends, as I'm about to discover. So yes, that little sculpture, I guess you could call it, took me by surprise, and it's to Bridget, who was an early Christian saint, but one of those early Christian saints, though, although there's some historical evidence for her, who was also a little bit suspiciously like the pre-Christian god of a similar name, and one of the things Bridget, I mean, basically, if you read her legends, some of what she did was pretty clearly magic, including being told she could have as much ground as she could cover with her cloak, and then she throws her cloak out and it greatly expands to cover the area of her convent in Kildare, or that they had an internal flame lighting there. You know, so I think we've probably seen the usual practices of the early Christian church of arriving in new localities and going, well, you know, I think we can probably hit a deal here, and your gods can become our saints, and then everybody can get on. Much better than burning at the stake, really. This aqueduct over the Barrow wasn't built till 1826, but in fact Monasterevin had been reached by 1726, and that title, the Venice of Ireland, seems a bit strange to us now, but it is the intersection of a number of canals, including a branch line to Montmellick, and then was also the point that was used to transfer passengers to coach services to several other locations around the country. So back in the day, Monasterevin would have been a real branch hub. Now I had stopped there and gone into town and got myself a Chinese meal at a takeaway because it was getting late and I was getting hungry, and at this stage of our journey I'm basically looking for somewhere to stop and eat that. I should say my notes of distances, particularly from here, are estimates. They're not that precise. Now there's two reasons for that. One is because I've done that diversion into the town, so my speedometer distance is different from the map one. But also I use Cycle Travel to plot this route. It's a great website that takes you down quiet roads. However, because some of these sections of the Barrow have been very recently opened, it wouldn't plot me on these at all, and so my map has me going on roads that are nearby, and that changes, of course, the distance between what Cycle Travel thinks it was and what I actually cycled. So, as I said, these are estimates. They're not off by more than 1 or 2 kilometres, but just if you're travelling this route yourself and recreating the journey, be aware that they are a little bit different. This is day 1 of a 2-day trip. I'll have the video up on day 2, I'd say by October, but we're getting near the end.
So, getting close to Vicarstown, which is a rather small village. There's a pub there though, so I might go for a pint if it's open. I picked up a Chinese takeaway in Monasterevin back there, which is slowly getting cold behind me. But I was hoping to find a picnic table. I haven't so far, but I know there's a bench at least by the canal in Vicarstown, so I could probably stop there. And then I'd probably have another hour's cycle before sunset. So I should imagine that'll get me somewhere in the region of Athy. If I spot a good place between now and then, I might pull in. I've got 83 kilometres down now. I've switched into low power mode to save the battery, so that should cover me for tomorrow. And yeah, doing pretty well.
I often wild camp when I'm cycle touring, and one of the reasons, apart from saving money, is that it allows this sort of spontaneous cycling where you're not really cycling to a set destination, you are cycling as far as you want to on that day, and then hoping you can spot somewhere to set up a tent.
So I stopped off in Monasterevin, got myself a Chinese, bottle of wine, and then I was waiting for somewhere where I could actually sit down, and that turned out to be Vicarstown, which is probably about another 10 kilometres. So I'm going to eat this now before it gets any colder.
a good part of my motivation with the channel is that people will see this and go, hey, this is something I could do as well, and this will, cycle touring and wild camping will become a much broader thing than it is currently in Ireland. And in turn, that's because, like a lot of people, I'm pretty concerned about climate change, but I think the kind of hairshut approach of telling people they can't take holidays anymore isn't really going to be helpful. And instead, I think what we need to do is think about how we define holidays. So move away from flying to somewhere sunny where you sit and drink by a pool for a week and look at activity. And I think if you've managed to watch this so far, you're probably realising what a joyous activity this sort of long distance cycling is. The wild camping aspect is also really pleasurable. I mean, very often you're in beautiful spots where you would not have access to otherwise unless you were wild camping, and this is going to be true this evening. We're now not far from where I'm going to set up for the night. And, you know, so if all that works for you, then do give the channel a follow. I'll be showing you all sorts of things about how to do cycle touring.
So we're a long way down into this journey, got fields and the Barrow navigation on the other side, about 90 kilometres cycled, a little bit of rain falling at the moment, and time to start finding somewhere to camp. Should be a good spot. I've seen a good few on the way down.
And the uncertainties and weather make it adventurous.
So very quick emergency stop there to get my wet gear on. Suddenly started raining quite heavily, and it's now 20 to 9, sunset is 9, so I need to be finding somewhere to camp. So the last thing I need is to have everything getting soaked, all my clothes getting soaked, just as I'm setting up the tent, because they're not going to dry out if that happens. So I think it's one of the reasons actually to always bring waterproofs. Even if you don't mind getting wet, the thing is getting wet at this moment, just when you're going to set up, it will be a disaster, because you're just going to be bringing loads of damp clothes into your tent. Your tent's probably going to be damp for being set up. We'll see if that's what the case is, and you're going to wake up the next morning and it's going to be damp and nasty. So yeah, good idea to have waterproofs.
We're now on the approach to Athy, and Athy was the first of the important river ports on the Barrow. So in terms of the older navigation before this Barrow line was built, you had significant boating coming all the way up to Athy. Anyway, it was quite navigable at that stage, and some of it was going well beyond that. What sort of cargoes were these boats carrying? Well, pigs apparently were transported on the Barrow, the only livestock there were. There wasn't really a passenger service as such. But something that was transported well into the modern era was large quantities of turf, because of course that was relatively cheap but extremely bulky, so canal boat transportation continued to make sense for it for quite some time after it did for other things. Athy is fairly complicated. I think I made a wrong turning here. I think I could have actually changed banks back at William Street and come onto that bridge and avoided this section of main road, but that's not what I did, and here I am finally on the Barrow itself, and you can see how it's transformed. Unfortunately, part of that transformation is that there are now no longer any nice tarmac strips. I didn't plan it this way, but in retrospect I'm actually very glad that I got to this stage where the canal merges onto the Barrow as sunset arrived, and so I got the full impact of the transformation as you go from, you know, a relatively controlled if overgrown waterway to a river that just expands out. And you know, there's an entirely different flow and sense of it, and you can't unfortunately hear the sounds of bird songs and things like that I was hearing here. But I arrived, I spotted a camping spot and put my tent up right by the river. I suspect this might have been used by somebody who was fishing, because there seems to have been a hole cut in the vegetation, but it was a fantastically lucky find for me and a super place to spend the night. Too dark for my GoPro, it fades out, so I'll end with some iPhone footage. And so the first day of my 2-day cycle ends with me setting up my tent in the dark by the Barrow and breaking out the rest of that bottle of wine, and then sitting there in absolute silence. There's nobody else around, listening to splashes in the river as I drank it before heading to sleep. And actually I slept very, very solidly before I woke in the morning. Give the channel a follow and you'll get the day 2 as we carry on down the Barrow to Saint Mullins, and then I cycle off to catch the train back to Dublin, making it a 2 rather than a 3-day trip. You'll find lots of diaries like this on the channel, so do have a look through the archive, and also there's lots of stuff on the technical aspects of cycle touring and e-biking in particular. Yeah, the other thing I would say is do have a look at the video description. I'll add links to relevant other videos in there and give you some more background on this particular trip. And if you have a question, then please do ask it as a comment. Or if you have a comment, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about the history of the river. This is a fairly quick overview I put together. Then please do write it in there. If it's a question, I'll certainly respond to it. If it's a comment, I'll give you my thanks. And I hope overall you found this an interesting story, and it would encourage you, if you're not already cycle touring, to consider it. You don't really need much. You can start off with that bike you have in the garage. And if you do, hopefully someday I will meet you on the road.